Before I begin, I need to say one thing plainly. The names you are about to hear were assigned for your clarity. The real names, the precise addresses, even certain dates, were withheld in the material I received and in the way I was asked to speak about it. The people involved are real, the events are real, the names are not. Now, let me take you to a small town tucked high in the Colorado Rockies, the kind of place where winter stays longer than it should, where the air is thin, and where a siren at night can travel miles through the dark like a warning meant for every living thing. It was late in the 1980s, close to midnight, when the first call came in. A wooden house on St. Florian Street. If you have never heard that name before, St. Florian is the patron saint of firefighters. In that town, the street sat not far from a modest Catholic church, a simple building that looked like it had been holding its breath against the mountains for 100 years. It wasn't a street with traffic. It wasn't a street people drove down unless they lived there or had a reason. It was quiet, narrow, and in the winter it could feel sealed off from the world. That night, the cold was brutal. You can imagine the temperature hovering well below freezing. Snow that had been plowed earlier in the day had already turned gray along the shoulders of the road. The sky was black and hard, without softness, without mercy. And then the bell tone of the dispatch broke it open. Silverton's volunteer fire engine rolled out like it always did, fast, loud, and half improvised. The men and women who served weren't full-time firefighters. They were mechanics, clerks, miners, truck drivers, parents, ordinary people who kept a pager close and answered it because no one else would. But one man answered it like it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. His name, in this account, is Jake Nolan. Jake was in his early 30s. During the day, he worked on engines and transmissions, hands permanently stained with oil. At night, he belonged to the town's siren. People said he could hear it before it sounded. They said he could smell smoke before anyone else. In Silverton, everyone knew his face. Everyone had a story about something he fixed for free, something he carried for someone who couldn't, some small kindness done quietly without a camera on it. That night, the lights from the first engine washed over the snow like red blood on white cloth. Jake was on scene almost immediately. There were witnesses who would later insist they saw him running toward the house before some of the apparatus even rounded the corner. Others claimed he arrived from the direction that made no sense, as if he had been nearby already, waiting. The house was fully involved when the volunteers pulled up. A hungry, roaring fire, the kind that eats old wood like paper and climbs the walls faster than a person can think. The windows glowed orange. The roofline snapped and threw sparks into the air like burning insects. The heat pushed back the cold in waves so that you could feel winter on your back and summer on your face at the same time. A mother was screaming. A child was screaming. Neighbors stood in the yard helpless, some in boots without coats, some holding blankets they couldn't do anything with. Jake didn't hesitate. That is what everyone remembers. That is what made the story clean and simple for the local paper. Man runs in. Man comes out carrying a child. Man goes back in and drags out the mother. Faces black with soot, hair singed, coughing, crying, alive. Someone threw an arm around Jake and shouted, "That's our guy!" People clapped. Some of them cried. The next morning, the headline called him a hero. They ran his photo, eyes red from smoke, jaw clenched like he was embarrassed by the praise. For a town like that, you don't get many victories. You don't get many moments when the story ends with everyone breathing again. So they held on to it. They held on to it so tightly that they didn't want to see what was sitting underneath it like a second layer of ash. Because when the investigators came through the next day, when the smell of wet charcoal still clung to the air and the snow around the foundation was melted into slush, they found things that did not fit the heroic story. The first thing was the origin, not the kitchen, not the fireplace, not the furnace. The fire had started in the corner of a living room where there should not have been a source. No overloaded outlet, no space heater, no lamp left on. No explanation anyone could give that would satisfy a trained eye. And then there was the wall, blackened wood, blistered, half collapsed, but in one spot, protected by the strange physics of flame, there were marks still visible, not paint, not soot patterns. Actual letters, as if someone had written them there with purpose. Fire cleanses. 2 words, a short sentence that pretends to be wise. The investigators photographed it. The firefighter saw it. A few neighbors saw it. It became a rumor in the grocery store line, the kind of rumor that grows teeth as it travels. Some said the homeowners must have written it long before as a joke, something edgy and harmless. Others claimed it appeared after the fire, like a message that rose out of the heat. One woman swore she had never seen it before, and she had been inside that house for potlucks and birthdays. A man said, with a shrug, that maybe it was some Bible thing. And Jake Nolan, the town's hero, said nothing about it at all. In the weeks that followed, that silence mattered. You see, a town like Silverton has an instinct for danger, but it also has an instinct for protecting its own. People prefer the version of events that lets them sleep. A faulty wire, a careless candle, a freak accident, but the investigators kept asking questions, and questions have a way of making people uncomfortable. Jake's name kept floating up, not as a suspect, not at first, but as a detail that didn't sit right. How did he get there so fast? Why was he already close enough to be the first set of hands on the front door? Why did he move with such certainty in a house he did not live in, turning down the hallway like he knew exactly where the bedrooms were? The easy answer was that he was experienced. He had done it before. He was brave, and bravery looks like certainty from the outside. But in the file I read, in the notes taken by people who were not interested in praising him, there were other observations. Jake did not pray at the scene. That might sound like nothing, but in a small mountain town with churches on every corner and crosses on a lot of walls, people pray as naturally as they breathe. They pray out loud. They make the sign of the cross. They call on God and Mary and every saint they can name, even if they haven't set foot in a pew in years. Jake did not. Jake watched the flames like a man watching something familiar. And later, when he talked about that night, his words were strange in a way that only becomes clear once you know what to listen for. He said the fire behaved. He said it moved off the hallway at the right time. He said he could feel when it would surge and when it would settle. He didn't say it like poetry. He said it like a mechanic describing an engine he understood. Now, I want to be careful here because there are explanations for that. Trauma can sharpen perception. Experience can create instinct. A firefighter who has survived enough close calls can learn how a structure breathes, how heat builds, how smoke pushes. But there is a difference between understanding fire and speaking about it as if it is listening. And that difference becomes even more unsettling when you look at who Jake Nolan was before the town decided he was their symbol. Jake grew up in Silverton. He left school early. He enlisted young. He came back with a few scars nobody asked about and a quietness that didn't match his age. He lived alone in a weathered trailer on the edge of town where the wind rattled the siding all night and the radio sometimes crackled with distant voices you couldn't quite make out. He drank cheap beer. He slept in fragments. Neighbors said they'd see his lights on at odd hours, like he was awake when the world was asleep. If the siren went off, he was there. If smoke rose over the ridge, he was already moving. People called it dedication. Some called it a gift. In the background of his life, almost like a stain that never fully washed out, was one story that only a few people knew, a wildfire. Years earlier, Jake and a crew caught in a shifting wind, flames running faster than they had any right to run, men shouting, trees igniting like torches, the kind of chaos that changes the shape of a person's mind. Jake survived when others did not. And in the account that made its way to me, there is a line that stands out like a cracked bell in a silent church. Jake claimed that during that wildfire, in the worst moment, when he was sure he was going to die, he heard a voice, not a scream, not a panic, a calm voice, almost gentle, instructing him to lie down, to breathe slowly, and promising that the fire would spare him. He did what the voice said. He lived. If you have ever counseled people after trauma, you know how the mind tries to make meaning. You know how a person can attach survival to a detail, a sound, a sensation, and turn it into a belief they cling to. Sometimes that belief is harmless, sometimes it saves them, and sometimes it opens a door. Because after the fire on St. Florian Street, Jake started walking into churches more often, but not the way most people do. He didn't show up on Sundays for coffee and smiles. He showed up when it was quiet. He sat in the back, and he watched the flame of a candle like it was the only honest thing in the room. People noticed him in a small Protestant chapel a few miles away, where sermons leaned hard into judgment, into punishment, into the idea that God's justice was a fire that purifies. The pastor there, in this account, used language that was very common in certain circles, especially in communities scared of drugs, of crime, of change, the kind of language that can comfort a frightened crowd, the kind of language that can poison a wounded soul. There is nothing wrong with preaching about sin. There is nothing wrong with warning people to turn away from what destroys them. But when a man stands in front of a congregation and repeats week after week that some things are so dirty only fire can clean them, you should understand what you are doing. You are putting a match in the hand of anyone who already believes flame is an answer. And Jake Nolan, the town's hero, was a man who had begun to believe that fire had answered him before. So the story of St. Florian Street did not end with applause and a newspaper clipping. It ended with a question the town did not want to ask. Why would a house burn from a corner that made no sense? Why would a message about cleansing appear on the wall like a signature? And why did the man who saved everyone look for just a second as if he recognized the fire like an old friend? That was the first layer. The next layer came later, when the town began to notice a pattern they could not ignore. But that is where this first part must stop, because if you want to understand how evil works in real life, you have to see how quietly it begins. Not with horns and spectacle, with a simple sentence in soot, fire cleanses, and a good man who starts to wonder if that sentence might be true. The second fire did not announce itself with the same shock as the first. That is how these things often move. The first incident feels like an exception. The second feels like bad luck. By the time the third arrives, the community starts looking for meaning, and meaning is exactly what something dark will offer them. In the material I reviewed, winter turned to spring and then to a thin mountain summer. The snow pulled back from the streets in dirty piles. Tourists came through on weekends, breathing hard in the high altitude, buying coffee and souvenirs and pretending the mountains were only scenery, not something that could swallow a person whole. Silverton tried to return to normal, but normal did not return. The second fire came in a place the locals had been complaining about for years, the sort of complaint people make at the end of a sentence, almost casually, like a shrug. The Red Lantern. It was a bar with a reputation that clung to it like smoke clings to clothing, a low building with a back lot that never seemed fully empty, even after midnight. The kind of place where a man could drink too much and go home angry. The kind of place where someone could trade a small bag for cash behind a dumpster and nobody would see it, because seeing it would require doing something about it. The owner in this account was Hank Grayson. Not a cartoon villain, a real kind of bad that exists everywhere. Loud, arrogant, and protected by the fact that he served people what they wanted. He sold alcohol to teenagers who looked old enough in bad light. He turned his head when drugs changed hands. He treated his wife with cruelty and called it stress. He laughed off complaints, and when the sheriff's department showed up, he smoothed it over with favors and quiet arrangements that everyone suspected but no one could prove. Silverton had 2 churches and 1 bar that drew the town's shame like a magnet. So when the Red Lantern burned, a portion of the town felt something they would never say out loud: relief. That is the first warning sign in the soul of a community. When a tragedy feels in some secret place like a solution. The fire started late, after the last tourists had gone back to their rentals and the locals had settled into their usual late-night habits. A call came in: smoke, flame, panic. People spilling into the parking lot in half-button jackets, coughing, shouting names. Jake Nolan arrived early again. That detail repeats in the file so often it becomes its own character. Always first, always close, always moving like he had been waiting for the sound. Witness statements described him stepping out of his truck before the engine was fully in place, pulling on gear with the practiced speed of a man who knew the motions by heart. He didn't stand back to size up the scene the way some volunteers did. He moved straight toward the heat. There were people inside who needed to be pulled out, and Jake did what Jake always did. He went in. He got out 2 men who had passed out near the back. He guided a woman with a bleeding scalp around broken glass. He dragged a coughing teenager to the curb and barked for someone to keep the kid upright. The newspaper printed another photo of him the next day, another small town headline, another tidy story about bravery. And then they found Hank Grayson, not in the main room where the flames were most visible from the street, but deeper in a storage area, wedged behind a door that had warped from heat. He didn't burn to ash. He died the way many people die in fires, from smoke, from poison, from not getting out in time. A man can be cruel and still die in a way that makes people uneasy. Death does that. It strips away the community's permission to hate openly. It makes everyone soften their voice, even if they don't soften their thoughts. And yet, in the same week as the funeral arrangements, there were people in town who said quietly, carefully, that maybe this was God cleaning house. That phrase appears in a witness statement, God cleaning house. Another person said something even closer to what had been on the wall at St. Florian Street. They said maybe fire was a kind of cleansing. You can hear the way language starts to shift, like a dial being turned one click at a time. Now, I want you to pay attention to what came next, because it's subtle. It isn't the kind of thing that makes headlines. It's the kind of thing that happens in pews and kitchens, in murmured conversations that feel harmless. A small Protestant church outside of town had a pastor who spoke with certainty, Pastor Ron Whitaker, in this account. He had a voice that filled the room in a manner that made people feel their fear had an explanation. He preached hard on sin. He preached hard on judgment. He used images that stuck, Sodom, Gomorrah, fire falling like a verdict. He talked about impurity like it was an infection. He talked about community rot like it was a disease that needed to be cut out. In itself, those themes are not new. You can find fire in Scripture. You can find warnings. You can find judgment. But you can also find mercy. And you can find the repeated insistence that vengeance belongs to God, not to a man with a match. In these sermons, mercy became quieter, and the idea that fire could be a tool of righteousness became louder. People listened because people were scared. Drugs had reached their town. Violence had touched their neighborhood. Someone's daughter had gotten in a car with the wrong crowd. Someone's son had been found unconscious behind the post office. Fear makes people crave simple answers. And then a second fire gave those answers a shape. Jake Nolan began attending those services, not every Sunday, not with his arm around a friend, not with a smile. He went alone. He sat back. He listened with his head slightly bowed, the way a man listens when he thinks a message is meant for him specifically. The file describes him leaving quickly, sometimes before the final hymn ended, as if he could not stay in the room any longer without doing something. At the same time, he kept appearing at the Catholic Church on St. Florian Street, but not during Mass. He came when the building was quiet, when the sanctuary lamp cast its small, steady glow, and the air smelled like old wood and wax. Father Michael Carney, the parish priest, noticed Jake sitting in the back, eyes fixed on the candle near the statue of St. Florian, the patron saint of firefighters, the same name on the street where the first strange message had been found. Jake did not talk much at first, but eventually he asked to confess. His confession was not what Father Michael expected. Jake didn't confess adultery. He didn't confess theft. He didn't confess the kind of sins people usually whisper about in a box. He confessed thoughts. He confessed an idea that had started to feel like a calling. He spoke in circles, careful, as if he didn't want to say the thing out loud because saying it would make it real. He said he sometimes wondered if certain places needed to be burned out the way you burn out an infection. He said he felt angry at the way the town was changing. He said he felt like he was always the one running toward the danger while everyone else pretended it wasn't there. Father Michael asked him where that idea came from. Jake said he had survived a wildfire because a voice told him what to do, and then he stopped talking. In the transcript, Father Michael later provided there was a note. At this moment, Jake glanced over his shoulder and went pale, as if he had heard a sound behind him. When Father Michael asked what was wrong, Jake swallowed and said nothing, only stared at the candle. If you have never sat with someone on the edge of obsession, you might think this is nothing. You might think it's just a man with trauma and guilt. But trauma doesn't usually write slogans on burned walls. And trauma doesn't usually produce a pattern. Over the next months, there was another fire. Smaller than the Red Lantern, but still significant. A shabby rental that neighbors complained about. A place where loud music carried at night, where men came and went too quickly. The kind of place people labeled without proof. It went up fast. The responders found evidence that the fire spread unnaturally quickly, that it didn't behave like an accident. But again, no one in town wanted to believe someone was doing this on purpose. They wanted to believe the town was being punished from above rather than attacked from within. Jake Nolan arrived first again. He carried out an elderly man, half asleep from the smoke. He got praised again. And in the aftermath, as the ash cooled, someone found the faintest trace of a phrase scratched where the fire hadn't completely erased it. Not a full sentence this time, just one word, half there, like a whisper that didn't want to be fully heard. Clean. At that point, the state got involved. Not because the town asked for help. Towns rarely ask for help when help comes with questions. The state got involved because 3 fires in a relatively short span with unusual burn patterns and suspicious origins start to look like a series. And a series means liability, headlines, pressure. A fire investigator was assigned. Dana McBride, in this account, near 40, experienced enough to have heard every joke, every dismissal, every sideways comment that women in that field still endure. She didn't waste time arguing. She let the work speak. Dana walked each scene like a person reading a language she had spent her life learning. She looked for origin points that didn't match the expected. She looked for pore patterns. She looked for hidden accelerants, the kind that can be masked beneath debris, the kind that won't announce itself unless you're trained to suspect it. And she found what she expected to find, not miracles, not divine judgment, human intent. One scene had trace evidence consistent with a flammable liquid. Another had burn patterns that suggested a deliberate start, shielded from wind. Another had an origin and a location that simply did not make sense unless someone wanted it there. She interviewed witnesses, and the same name kept showing up like a fingerprint you can't wash off. Jake Nolan, the hero, the man the town trusted. Dana didn't announce her suspicion. She didn't storm into the firehouse and accuse him in front of his friends. That would have been foolish. That would have turned the town against her and driven the truth deeper underground. Instead, she did what good investigators do. She built the story from the edges. She asked who called it in first. Jake. She asked who arrived first. Jake. She asked who was already in gear when the engines rolled up. Jake. She asked who seemed less surprised by the way the fire was moving than anyone else on scene. Jake. She requested logs, dispatch records, response times. She compared distances. She measured routes. She estimated drive times on snow-packed roads and narrow streets. And a question began to form that was impossible to ignore. How does a man who lives on the edge of town in a trailer outside the main grid consistently arrive before people who live closer? There are explanations, of course. A man might speed. A man might take risks. A man might be awake when others are asleep. But in the margins of Dana's notes, this part caught my attention. She wrote a single line. He isn't just responding, he may be orbiting like a moth circling a flame before it lands. At the same time, Father Michael began to see his own pattern. Jake's visits to the Catholic Church grew more frequent. He was drawn specifically to that candle near St. Florian. He would stare at it with an intensity that looked almost hungry. He would breathe shallowly, like someone trying not to inhale too deeply for fear of taking in smoke. Once, Father Michael approached him gently, asking if he wanted to talk. Jake's response was sharp, almost defensive. He said the candle was safe. He said fire could be obedient. He said sometimes it only needed permission. Father Michael asked him permission from whom? Jake looked at him for a long moment and then answered in a way that makes my skin tighten even now. He said, "It has a name." Father Michael pressed carefully, the way a priest learns to press without breaking what little stability a person has left. Jake's lips moved as if the word tasted strange in his mouth. "Cawther," he said it quietly, almost reverently. Father Michael asked what that meant. Jake's eyes didn't leave the flame. He said it meant fire that cleans. He said it meant fire that knows what to take and what to spare. He said it meant fire that was not the enemy. In the file, Father Michael admitted he did not immediately declare this demonic. He considered trauma, hallucinations, a mind trying to cope with death and fear by turning a natural force into something personal. That is a wise caution. But here is the problem. Whether the voice was demonic in the strict sense or not, the fruit of the voice was moving toward destruction. That much was clear. Dana McBride, working from evidence, and Father Michael, working from confession and pastoral instinct, were walking toward the same truth from different roads. Neither of them knew yet how close the town was to the moment when the pattern would stop being a pattern and become a body count. Jake Nolan was still being praised. He was still being called a hero. And somewhere in the private space between his thoughts and the flame, something that called itself Cawther was teaching him a theology made of ash. That burning the dirty parts of the town was righteousness, and that saving people from fire was only half his work. If you want to understand how a person gets pulled into that kind of madness, you must understand this. The voice did not begin by telling him to murder. It began by praising him for being brave. It began by giving meaning to his trauma. It began by taking the language of faith, cleansing, judgment, purification, and using it like a blade. Dana McBride was close to enough proof to act, but not close enough to move without risking everything. Father Michael was close to naming the spiritual danger, but not close enough to know whether naming it too soon would drive Jake deeper into it. And Jake himself was standing between two worlds. The world where fire is an emergency to fight, and the world where fire is a friend that whispers. In the next part of this account, a single night would force the question that everyone had avoided. Was Jake Nolan running toward the flames to save people? Or was he, in some terrible way, running toward the flames to feed them? What happened next was not dramatic in the way people imagine evil to be. It did not come with thunder. It came with routine. It came with a familiar tone in the dispatcher's voice, a familiar rush of boots on concrete, the familiar shiver of adrenaline that volunteers learn to love and fear at the same time. And it came with a choice measured in seconds. In the weeks after Dana McBride began her work, she did something that looks ordinary on paper, but becomes heavy when you consider what was at stake. She stopped treating the fires like isolated tragedies and started treating them like a conversation between someone and flame. She pulled reports from neighboring counties. She compared weather, wind, humidity. She looked at call times, response times, who was first on scene. She asked quiet questions at the hardware store about who had been buying certain supplies. She spoke with dispatchers who were used to gossip, but not used to someone taking their words seriously. And one of them, in a moment of hesitation, gave her a detail that never appeared in the local paper. On more than one night, the dispatcher had noticed Jake Nolan's voice on the line before the first engine even confirmed it was rolling. Not a frantic caller, not a panicked witness. Jake, calm, direct, already describing the fire's behavior, already telling them where the smoke was pushing, where the wind was pulling it, where the structure would likely fail. It sounded, the dispatcher said, like he could see it. Dana didn't accuse him based on that, but she underlined the note hard enough to crease the page. Around the same time, Father Michael Carney began keeping his own record. not a file like Dana's, not photographs and measurements, a pastoral record, dates of visits, words used in confession, changes in posture, moments where Jake seemed present, and moments where Jake seemed like someone else was leaning over his shoulder. It's important to say this plainly. Father Michael did not walk into those early conversations looking for a demon behind every sentence. He did what a sensible priest does. He looked first for the human wounds that invite confusion. War can leave a man trapped in fight or flight. Guilt can twist itself into rituals. Trauma can create voices, sensations, compulsions. But there is also the reality that certain thoughts do not merely rise from within. They present themselves with a foreignness that unsettles the soul. They flatter, they rationalize, they isolate. They push a person toward destruction while calling it virtue. And in Jake's case, the thought had a name. Cawthor. That name kept showing up like a signature. One afternoon, Father Michael found Jake in the church again, not praying, not reading, just watching the sanctuary lamp and the candle near St. Florian. Jake's hands were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee as if he needed the heat to keep from shaking. His eyes were fixed on the flame with the kind of attention a starving man gives the plate. Father Michael sat in the pew behind him and waited. He did not force conversation. Sometimes, silence is the only way to see what a person is truly carrying. After a long time, Jake spoke without turning around. He said, "It doesn't lie." Father Michael asked softly, "What doesn't lie?" Jake swallowed. "Fire." Father Michael said, "Fire doesn't tell the truth. Fire consumes. It does what it does." Jake's head tilted, like he was listening to someone else answer on his behalf. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter and flatter. He said, "It takes what's dirty." Father Michael asked, "Who told you that?" Jake turned then, and for a moment, his eyes looked like a man who realized he had spoken too much. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared as if he smelled smoke. He said, "I'm trying to stop thinking it." Father Michael asked, "Is it a thought, Jake, or is it a voice?" Jake's lips parted, then closed. He looked past Father Michael into the shadows of the church, as if expecting someone to step out of them. And then he stood abruptly, coffee sloshing onto the floor, and left without another word. If the story ended there, you might say it was a troubled man unraveling. But the next fire did not allow that comfort. It happened near the church, close enough that the first bell of the Catholic building could be heard over the first crackle of wood. A storage warehouse, old and half forgotten, used by a few small businesses to keep tools and seasonal inventory. The kind of building nobody thinks about until it's burning. Neighbors later said they heard arguing first. Raised voices, sharp words, then the sound of feet running. One woman said she smelled something sweet and chemical for a moment, like gasoline, though she wasn't sure until the investigators asked. Then flame. Not a slow bloom, not a gradual spread. A sudden, aggressive roar that lit the night from the inside out. Dispatch called it in. Volunteers scrambled. The engine rolled. Jake arrived before it. Again, that is the detail that keeps returning, and at this point in the file, it stops sounding like dedication and starts sounding like choreography. Jake was seen near the side of the building, not standing back, not scanning for hazards like a cautious responder, but close enough that heat shimmered off his face. He was staring at the warehouse as if he was waiting for something inside to finish speaking. A young firefighter shouted his name, and Jake flinched like a man pulled out of a dream. The crew moved in, hoses charged, water hit flame and turned into steam, the air filled with that awful scent of wet ash and melting plastic. Then someone shouted that there might be people inside. Teenagers, 2 of them, in that town. Kids used empty spaces, like warehouses, for hiding, for smoking, for being reckless in the way the young sometimes are when they believe life will forgive them. It wasn't confirmed at first. It was a rumor shouted over noise. But rumors like that force action. Jake moved toward the entrance. He was the one who always went in first. But this time, Something happened that the witnesses could not explain. He stopped. Right at the threshold, not a full stop like a man struck by fear, a pause, a hesitation, a stillness that did not match the urgency around him. One firefighter later told Dana that Jake's face looked attentive, not scared. Attentive, like he was listening to instructions. Dana wrote that down. Father Michael, when he read it later, went quiet for a long time because that pause mattered. Inside that pause is where a life can be lost. And inside that pause is where temptation does its real work. Not by forcing your hand, but by convincing you that delaying your good instinct is justified. Jake went in after the pause. He moved through smoke and heat, calling out, sweeping his light, feeling the floor with his boot, keeping one hand on the wall the way he had been trained. He found one of the teenagers first, coughing, disoriented, face slick with sweat and fear. Jake grabbed him, hauled him toward the entrance. And then the building answered with the kind of violence that makes firefighters old in an instant. A section of roof collapsed, not the dramatic cinematic collapse you see on television, but a brutal drop of timber and sheet material snapping down with the weight of a mountain. It caught Jake's leg, pinned him hard, heat surged. Smoke thickened. The sound inside became a living thing. Jake screamed. He tried to pull free. He tried to move the debris. He shouted for help. And the teenager he had been dragging stumbled out into the night alone, collapsing into arms that grabbed him and pulled him back from the doorway. Jake was still inside. The second teenager was still inside. The crew surged forward, and for a brief moment, Jake became what the town always believed he was, a man trapped by the very thing he fought. They got him out, but not before the fire took its price. Jake's leg was broken. His skin was burned in patches deep enough that the smell lingered on the gear. His lungs had taken smoke. He was conscious only in flashes, eyes wide and unfocused, mouth working like a man trying to speak around an invisible hand. They asked him about the second teen. Jake coughed and shook his head, and whether he meant no or didn't know, nobody could tell. Inside, the fire finished what it had started. The boy's name in the file was Tyler James, 17, old enough to be cocky, young enough to still be a child when you look at his school picture. He died where the heat had pooled, behind a collapsed section, in a pocket where the smoke had no mercy. In the days that followed, Silverton's hero became Silverton's tragedy. The paper ran a story about Jake's injury, about his bravery, about the boy lost. People dropped off casseroles and cards. The firehouse held a small vigil. Pastor Ron spoke about judgment and the wages of sin, and some people nodded along because grief makes people desperate for explanations. Dana McBride did not nod. Dana went to the hospital. Jake was in a burn unit, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. Monitors beeped with their indifferent rhythm. His body was wrapped in bandages. His face looked smaller, stripped of the confident expression people associated with him. And then Dana read the nursing notes. Those notes were not meant as evidence. They were meant as care. Nurses chart what a patient says while drifting in and out, because sometimes delirium reveals medical issues. But sometimes delirium reveals something else. Jake had been murmuring at night, half awake, eyes open but not seeing. He whispered fragments. He argued with someone who wasn't there, and then he said, clearly enough for the nurse to write it down, words that did not sound like a man hallucinating randomly. He said, I did what you said. Why didn't you save my leg? You promised. You said you'd protect me if I fed you. Fed you. Dana stared at that phrase until the letters blurred, because that is not the language of trauma alone. That is the language of an exchange. That is the language of a bargain. Dana took that note and, against her better instincts, brought it to Father Michael. She did not do it because she wanted religion to solve her case. She did it because she had reached the edge of what pure evidence could explain. Father Michael read it once, then again. Then he closed his eyes, as if he had just heard a confession he did not want to be true. He said quietly, "This is how people talk when they believe they have given consent." Dana asked him, "Consent to what?" Father Michael did not answer right away. He stood and walked to the front of the church, to the candle near St. Florian, and looked at the flame as if he was asking God for the right words. Then he said, "Consent to a lie." Dana left the church that night with two certainties. One, she had enough now to pursue charges for arson and for the death that resulted. Two, whatever was happening in Jake Nolan's mind had grown beyond ordinary self-deception. Father Michael, for his part, requested permission from his bishop to do what the church does carefully and reluctantly, a specific pastoral intervention aimed at liberation, not spectacle. He did not call it an exorcism to outsiders. He did not advertise it. He did not invite an audience. In the files I reviewed, there is no theatrical language, no talk of flying furniture or voices booming from the ceiling. There is only the description of a hospital room, fluorescent light, white walls, medical equipment, and a man in pain who had finally run out of heroic narratives to hide behind. Father Michael entered the room with a small book, a stole folded over his arm, and the steady demeanor of someone who understands that spiritual warfare is most often fought in quiet places where the world does not look. Jake's eyes tracked him immediately, not with peace, with suspicion. Father Michael said, "Jake, I'm here because you asked for help, even if you didn't say it out loud." Jake's throat worked. His voice was ragged. "I'm going to prison." Father Michael said, "That may happen, but right now I'm more concerned with what has been happening inside you." Jake's lips trembled. "It's not inside me. It's like it's right here." He turned his head slightly toward the corner of the room where the shadows gathered behind a chair. Father Michael did not follow his gaze with fear. He followed it with discernment. He asked, "Does it have a name?" Jake swallowed. "Cawthor." Father Michael said the name once, not like a challenge, not like a chant, but like a diagnosis spoken clearly. Then he said, "Tell me what you believe Cawthor is." Jake's answer came in a rush, the way people speak when they have been repeating the same justification to themselves for a long time. He said it was fire's messenger. He said it taught him that some places were poisoning the town. He said saving people from fire was good, but letting fire do its work was also good. He said he had been chosen to know which was which, and when he said those words, the monitor's rhythm changed slightly, not in a dramatic spike, but in a nervous flutter that any nurse would recognize as stress. Father Michael did not argue theology with him the way you might argue with a stranger online. He did something much older and much more grounded. He asked Jake to tell the truth in simple sentences. "Did you start the fires?" Jake stared at the ceiling. His eyes filled. He nodded. "Once." "Did you tell yourself you were doing it for God?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Yes." "Did the voice encourage you?" Jake's breath shook. "Yes." Father Michael said, "Then the voice is not from God." Jake's eyes snapped toward him. "You don't understand. It saved me in the wildfire. It told me what to do." Father Michael said, "Something can rescue you from one danger and still lead you into another. Not everything that helps you survive is holy." Jake tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He looked trapped inside his bandages. Father Michael continued, "If this voice is good, it will lead you to repentance, to humility, to life, but it has led you to pride, to judgment, to destruction." Jake whispered, "It told me the town was dirty." Father Michael said, "It told you to play God." Then he began the prayers, not shouted, not dramatized, spoken like a physician speaking to an infection, calmly, precisely, without feeding panic. He prayed for Jake's mind, for clarity, for the breaking of deception, for the courage to accept responsibility and reject the false comfort of calling evil good. He named Cawthor again, and when he did, Jake's face twisted not into a monstrous snarl, but into grief and resistance, like a man being asked to give up the one thing that made his suffering feel meaningful. Father Michael asked Jake a question that is simple and brutal. Do you renounce it? Jake's eyes were wet. If I renounce it, then it was all for nothing. Father Michael said, if you don't renounce it, it will take everything from you and still demand more. There was a long silence. The hospital sounds filled it. The soft hiss of air, the small beeps, the distant shuffle of staff. Jake's fingers, wrapped in gauze, flexed weakly as if he was trying to grab onto something. Then he spoke, and when he spoke, it was not heroic. It was not polished. It was raw, and it sounded like a man finally choosing reality over the story that had possessed him. He said, I renounce you, Cawthor. You're not an angel. You're not God. You just want to watch things burn. You wanted to burn me too. As he said it, the monitor jumped again, then settled. A nurse would call it physiology. A priest hears something else. The moment a person's will moves back into alignment with truth. Father Michael did not promise Jake that his legal consequences would disappear. He did not promise Jake that his pain would vanish. He did not promise that the darkness would never whisper again. He simply said, now you belong to God again, not to that lie. Dana McBride stood outside the room as a witness, not to a miracle, but to a moment of accountability. That is what this story is, at its core. Not a tale about a demon in a mountain town, a tale about how evil is often parasitic. It feeds on what is already wounded, and it grows fat on religious language used without wisdom. When Jake was transferred into custody, Silverton's myth collapsed. The town that had cheered him had to swallow the truth that their hero had been lighting the very flames he fought. People wanted someone else to blame. Some blamed Pastor Ron because his sermons had supplied the rhetoric. Some blamed the bar owner because his cruelty made him an easy target in hindsight. Some blamed the teenagers because blaming the dead is easier than facing your own blindness. Father Michael wrote a line in his journal that stayed with me when I first read it, and it is the line I will leave you with here, because it explains why this case matters beyond one town. He wrote, in essence, that he could not say with certainty whether Cawthor was a distinct demonic presence or a name Jake gave to an obsession. But he could say this with certainty. Whenever people begin to talk about burning human beings and calling it cleansing, something unclean has already entered the conversation. And once it enters, it does not need much. It only needs a wounded man who wants his pain to mean something. It only needs a community willing to call destruction justice. It only needs one voice, soft enough to sound like conscience, whispering in the dark, fire cleanses. And it only needs someone, somewhere, to believe it.